You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis. I'm your host for BioTalk, and we have another exciting Baltimore emerging entrepreneurial company that we're going to have on BioTalk today. And we're fortunate to have the co-founder, who is Doug Falk, CEO of Vita Therapeutics. And Doug, welcome to BioTalk.
Thanks, Rich. It's great to be here. Really appreciate you allowing me to join the show today.
I think it's fantastic because you got a lot of exciting things that the listeners are going to be interested in hearing. And we also know that you have some other important meetings today, and we're going to make certain we can keep you focused. And hopefully this BioTalk can be used as a marketing tool for you to raise all that money you need in the future.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Great. So what we like to do is start off, since a lot of people don't know about Vita, but more importantly, they don't know about Doug. Why don't you give the listeners a little bit about your background and how you evolved to where you are today, Doug?
Sure. Yeah. So as Rich said, my name is Doug Falk. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Vita Therapeutics. And my background's a little bit different. I have a formal education from a science perspective, master's in biotechnology from Johns Hopkins. And then I actually spent and started my entire career on the investment side of the biotech industry. I was doing really early stage investments into small private life science companies all the way through publicly traded biotech companies. And it was really that path that led me to starting a company like Vita and getting to where we are today.
And basically, why did you, I guess you got your interest by all of these companies that you were reviewing and looking at research on related to the life science industry. So what tickled your fancy to decide that you wanted to go into that career into biotechnology?
Yeah. So, it was really one specific instance that started it all for me down the path to where I am. So I started off as a pure generalist. I had no science background coming out of undergrad, got a job doing investment banking, absolutely hated it, learned a little bit more about the financial world and that banking just wasn't for me. And I really felt that I was more suited on the research side of the finance industry. I really had a desire to further learn, what made for a good investment, what made for not so great of investment. So I was really fortunate to catch on to a local firm here in Baltimore called Brown Advisory, where I was able to join the research team. And I started off as a pure generalist, but really early on into my career, it was actually the director of research at the firm, Tim Hathaway. He realized I had this different skill set than some of the other analysts. Most fundamental analysts, they sit in their office all day, they build out some financial models, they're avid readers. I had no problem walking up to anyone and just asking them about what they did and just trying to better learn about whatever investment I was looking at. So we ended up creating this role that was actually somewhat investigative in nature. And the way it worked at Brown is anytime that there was an answer that we thought knowing the answer to was going to help us buy a company or sell a company, they would pretty much just throw me out into the world to go figure it out. So I got this assignment that was researching the transcatheter aortic valve replacement industry. So this is about 7-8 years ago. And at the time, TAVR is what it goes by from a short acronym. No one knew if this was going to take off or not, or if it was going to stick with the traditional surgery route. Surgery had been what people with aortic stenosis had been getting for the last 30 years. And then this new technology allowed potentially for the procedure itself to be incredibly less invasive, but it was still new and nobody really knew what that approach was going to take out. So I went on this trip, and let's see if I can remember it properly. So I went from Baltimore to New York to Philadelphia to Rome to London to San Francisco to Seattle. And it was a 3-week trip. And the entire time I was talking to cardiac surgeons and cardiac interventionalists. And it was that single trip, that single investment opportunity for me that really just changed my world. And it just created this inspiration and passion that I didn't know existed for life sciences and for biotech. So what I ended up doing was going back to school, getting my master's in biotechnology from Johns Hopkins. And then after that, I began focusing fully on just biotechnology investments. So really interesting path to kind of get here, but I absolutely love this world and couldn't be more grateful for all the opportunities that have led to where we are today.
You bring back good memories for me because I've somewhat been in the investment and the venture world for more decades than I care to remember. But, I used to come to Alex Brown's meetings in Baltimore in the in the late 80s and 90s. And they used to have annual conferences, and they focused in sort of the environmental world and the life science world. And I would come in for those meetings. So I didn't realize that I would end up in this region 20, 30 years later. And now I'm talking to someone with Brown Advisory, former Brown Advisory, which was a successor to Alex Brown in the Baltimore area, which has really been very influential in helping cultivate the ecosystem within Baltimore from an investment banking perspective.
Absolutely.
Let me talk a little bit, since you've been on both sides now. Was it a difficult transition for you to go from the investment side and then get on the other side where you're actually raising money from venture capitalists and investment bankers?
So it's a great question. I wouldn't say it's difficult. I think each role has its own, difficulties that they, kind of face on a regular basis. But I think what I had spent a lot of time doing, I think when I was on the investment side, was really preparing myself to be on this side now. I used to always say, really what you did from an investment standpoint is you interviewed management teams. Right. And you sat there on the other side of the table and you tried to ask them everything that is, to help you make your investment decision. But really what all that is just an interview. So I always say I had a first class education, I think, in learning how to run a successful biotech company. I got to meet a lot of management teams who I thought were fantastic and did a great job. That helped inspire me and helped me build the right culture and the right path that we have here at Vita. But I also met a lot of teams that, I thought over the years we're doing, the right thing. And that really helped scope, the type of leader, the type of company that we really want to build here at Vita. So I think because I had those years of education, of being on the other side of the table, I think it's actually helped benefit me substantially. Because now I kind of get to wear both hats, where I can put myself in the other end person's shoes who I'm talking to and understand exactly what they're thinking, exactly what they care most about, and then try to take that back to what we're doing here at Vita and grow in the most appropriate way.
Well, let's circle back to Johns Hopkins, which has been really a great catalyst for getting a lot of companies started within this region. But, with your investment background and then going to get your master's at Johns Hopkins, how did that influence you to start looking for something that you may have a personal interest in, which led to the creation and the co-founding of Vita?
Great question, Rich. So I was really fortunate. When I started my master's program, I was just kind of like an avid networker and got an opportunity to go out and speak to a lot of different academic researchers at Johns Hopkins. And that's actually right around the time when I actually met my co-founder and Vita's chief scientific officer, Dr. Peter Anderson. So Peter had been running his own cell biology group and lab at Hopkins for really the last 10 years prior to joining me here at Vita. And him and I, we really hit it off. We had very complementary personalities. We both had that same goal where one day we kind of wanted to start something in the regenerative medicine space, something that really pushed therapeutics to that next level and working on something that could truly be restorative versus just, mitigative. And really what we started doing was just networking with a few other researchers. We were really fortunate. Our roles and mindsets were kind of embraced by some others at Hopkins, particularly some of our scientific co-founders, Dr. Gab-Sang Lee, Dr. Catherine Wagner, and Dr. Alan Friedman. Well, we really started playing that entrepreneur in residence type role, helping understand how to go from that academic idea or academic invention actually to commercialization. So, Vita got started about 2.5 years ago, but that process probably was about 3 years prior to that. So in many ways, I feel like we've been working on this science and working on the development of our technologies for probably over 5 or 6 years from those early days when we were just doing it in an academic lab at Johns Hopkins.
Well, it's a great lead in because we're tempting the audience here basically because we haven't really said what Vita does. So with all of this investigation you've done and research and finding partners and everything else at Hopkins, what's the magic sauce and the technology that you guys have as a basis for Vita?
Absolutely. And happy to dive deep into it. So at a very high level, Vita is a cell engineering company that focuses on combining gene editing technology with traditional cell therapy with the hopes of potentially replacing defective cells in patients with functional cells. So to go one step deeper, we currently have 3 different platform technologies that we work with. But very quickly to introduce you to all 3, The first is actually a neuromuscular platform where we're using a very specific technology known as induced pluripotent stem cells. So this is a process where you take a blood cell from a human being and then reverse engineer it down to its stem cell state. From there, we have a patented protocol to take that stem cell and turn it into a very specific cell type in our bodies known as satellite cells. Satellite cells, they're the very foundation of muscle biology. Once our muscles are injured, a series of mechanisms occurs that actually starts the satellite cell to actually repair or replace that damaged muscle. And that's exactly what we've shown preclinically. We actually can prove that our human satellite cells and various different genetic mice models can actually repair and replace human muscle. So long term, our goal is to actually bring these cells to a number of different degenerative muscle conditions. But to start, we're starting with a really specific select group of patients with a really, really high unmet medical need known as limb-girdle muscular dystrophy 2A. We've put together a program called VTA100. And right now, every single partnership that's needed to get this into the clinic has already been fully established. And we're anticipating filing that IND at some point late next year. Our second platform is actually an immunotherapy platform. So this is where we start with a very specific cell that we extract to the body called myeloid cells. Myeloid cells, they're the progenitor cell to a number of different cell types in our bodies. And what we have is a proprietary way to actually take that myeloid cell and actually genetically lock it into its tumor cytotoxic macrophage state. So essentially what that means is we're creating these killer macrophages. We have some great preclinical data that suggests that that treatment alone can be a potential treatment for glioblastoma, prostate cancer, pancreatic carcinoma, and triple-negative breast cancer. And now we're really in the final stage of development where we're taking that technology, which we also licensed out of Johns Hopkins, and combining it with some next generation proprietary CAR technology, which we actually believe is going to give us an even better, a more profound anti-efficacy tumor effect. So our goal is to select our initial indication for that program. This is VTA 300 at some point in the next 6 months. But we're actually planning on filing that IND at some point towards the middle of next year. So we really consider both the immunotherapy platform as well as the neuromuscular platform really are co-leading programs here at Vita. And then finally, we have this third platform, which is really the long-term goal that we have. And this is to actually develop one universal hyperimmunogenic cell line. So basically one cell line that's completely evading the immune system that we can use to differentiate to universal satellite cell, universal myeloid cell, and then use those cell banks to treat a whole bunch of patients, regardless of their DNA, and at the same time drastically reduce the cost of what we're developing here at Vita. The reason why we set the company up in this very unique strategy, we're first focusing on that autologous approach, which means we're building a specific cell therapy for each specific patient. And then long-term focusing on this universal approach is really just quite simple. We want to prove out the biology of our cell types before we then worry about evading the immune system, right? So we want to show that our satellite cells can repair and replace muscle. We want to show that our myeloid cells can be an effective treatment against solid tumors. And then once we've done that, that's when we want to move forward with this universal technology that we have into the clinic. So I'll stop right there. Hopefully that gives you a really good summary of all the different technologies that we're working on here at Vita.
Great summary. And if I put my investment banking hat on for a second and ask you a question.
Yeah, please.
Which you're probably going to get asked a lot, and you already have been asked a lot. You've got 3 platform technologies, which are good because they're not single use. You have a platform there that has multiple uses, but you have an emerging company, limited resources, 3 platform technologies. You're talking about 2 INDs, possibly a third in the future. How do you balance this portfolio from a priority standpoint with all of the resources you need just to even get one of those into the clinical environment and to get one commercialized?
People don't necessarily realize out of the gate how similar all 3 of these technologies are. At the end of the day, what are we here at Vita? We're a team of cell engineers who are experts at using CRISPR technology and experts at differentiating cell types. And when you look at the 2 programs, the 2 cell types that we have, the neuromuscular satellite cells and the immunotherapy myeloid cells, the proprietary aspects that we're actually doing to these cells are almost identical. We're making specific genetic edits, and then those edits we've identified is going to make these cells essentially functional in these patients that currently have defective cell types, right? So from a pure biology standpoint and from cell biology standpoint, what we're doing on both of those 2 technologies is actually exactly the same, right? So it actually makes sense to have this one team that's working on that. And then when you take those technologies and you apply it to that third technology that I talked about, really what that is a potential technology that in theory could be used for any cell type that gets differentiated, right? So every single dollar and every single cost that gets spent there is actually a shared cost across the current cell types that we have now, and maybe even one day the future cell types that we're not currently working on, but maybe we'll look to bring into the company. So I think our three technologies actually complement each other incredibly well. And again, that third technology is really the hope is that this is going to make for an incredibly cost-effective treatment that allows us to mainstream, go after a much broader, different patient population.
Well, apparently your explanation and your strategy is working because you continue to progress in the financial world. And I'll talk about that in a second. But more importantly, you talked about patience. Anybody doing what you are trying to attempt to do really need to look at the clinical strategy that you need to have for your portfolio of platform technologies. So what is the benefit of having this relationship you have with Johns Hopkins? And talk a little bit about your clinical strategy and other partners you have that you're utilizing in this process.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think with the relationship with Hopkins goes deeper and starts earlier than just the clinical process. So maybe back up. I think back to the way Baltimore was like 7-8 years ago, and the infrastructure wasn't quite there to what it is now. And I don't think we would have been here without what Hopkins had got up and running. So, they have this incubator called Fast Forward that really allows for young, early startup companies with, little financial resources to go ahead and get started. So we started out of that incubator. It's called Fast Forward. We had just a bench. We had one wet bench, and then I didn't even have an office. I just sat in the open area every day and got to know everyone as they were walking by. That really allowed us to get the resources to go ahead and get started. We since expanded. At one point, we had 6 different private labs within the Hopkins ecosystem. We actually moved out. Now we're over at the University of BioPark. But I think providing that initial resources was huge coming out of Hopkins. That really allowed us to kind of set us down this path towards success. And then beyond that, I think being a part of the medical campus, it allowed us as a company to stay really in touch with a lot of these scientific co-founders that we had, and also, other academic researchers. So when we started the company, we actually just had that neuromuscular platform that I was talking about. But shortly after we started the company, we caught wind of this immunotherapy platform, and we really started working and collaborating with the academic professor, Dr. Alan Friedman, who is originally the inventor of that technology. And that kind of allowed us to bring that into the company and build what the Vita is today. So I think Hopkins really allowed for us to go out and build a company that we want it in the most appropriate way. And then now taking that back as we're gearing up for these clinical trials, hopefully, late next year, I think Hopkins has created a natural fit for a perfect partner. So as it relates to VTA100, which is the neuromuscular satellite cell program, we've had extensive conversations with pretty much everyone, all of the top physicians in the country as relates to muscular dystrophy. And although we haven't officially enrolled these clinical sites yet, we wouldn't be doing that until we actually have the clinical trial number and the IND. We've already gotten buy-in from 3 of those clinical sites. So one of them is Hopkins, it's KKI, so it's Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is their affiliate hospital. And then the other 2 are actually VCU and Kansas University of Medical Center. So Hopkins really helped make that happen a lot quicker than it probably would have, just given our relationship. And right now, as it relates to VTA300, which is the immunotherapy program, we've already started preliminary conversations with several different clinical oncologists at Hopkins about the prospects of having our clinical trial there. So because we haven't disclosed what our initial indication is going to be, we can't really go any farther than that. But we went out and we talked to 4 different clinical oncologists who focus on the 4 different solid tumors that we're researching. And once we have one selected, we'll continue those conversations and hopefully look to set up our clinical trial at Hopkins as well.
One of the things that a lot of early entrepreneurs in life sciences don't recognize is the importance of key opinion leaders. And basically, it sounds like, first of all, being a spin out of Hopkins and having a relationship with Hopkins makes it probably easier to open doors as you're trying to talk to other KOLs around the United States. So talk a little bit about your KOL strategy and what you've been doing to put your scientific advisory boards and KOLs together.
Rich, you're talking about something that's so important. And I think that was really the first thing that we actually did at Vita, really prior to even formally launching the company. Because I think it's all about the people who are helping as a whole, right? It takes a village, right? It's not just a few different individuals. So From the earliest days, what we tried to do was surround ourselves at Vita, both from a full-time perspective, but also from an advisor perspective, with folks that were experts in areas that we weren't. We were really fortunate. If you take a look at our scientific advisory board, we went after some of the top names in the iPSC space. Lorenz Studer, he was the scientist behind Vita Therapeutics, which is really a company, a cell engineering company that we actually built Vita after, both targeting different cell types, but very, very similar overall concept in general. And we were able to track some of these really, really great scientists to join us and really help us build the path that we're kind of moving forward with. So I think that ecosystem, that kind of start with Hopkins, certainly helped open up those doors a lot easier if we, hadn't been at such a great academic institution. But it was really important to go out and get so many different people on board. Our scientific co-founders, the three individuals I mentioned earlier, Dr. Catherine Wagner, Dr. Gab Sang Lee, and Dr. Alan Friedman, they've been incredibly supportive. As we've started that tech transfer process, you don't always have that when you start a company out of academia. Sometimes the academic professor or researchers aren't essentially on board. We were super fortunate. All three have been fantastic. They've been huge champions of what we're doing, and they really helped us as we made that transition to that commercialization path. So I think it's been really important, the entire team that we built here. We wouldn't be here today without that collective team.
Well, thank you for that reflection. Now, we've been talking about the investment banking world and financing, and let's talk about your financing strategy and successes you've had to date, and what is your financing strategy for the future?
Yeah. So absolutely. So to really back up, we really started Vita back in October of 2019. So what we did really quickly was raise about a $2.5 million seed round. We closed that in January of 2020. And that went along with about $2 million of historical grant money that had gone into our technology at that point. And that really allowed us to get started. So that allowed us to grow from that one bench, fast forward into our own private lab. It allowed us to fully exclusively license out the original neuromuscular technology that we were working with, and then really go out and bring on some full-time scientists to start replicating everything we had done within Hopkins, but in our own lab.
Doug, before you go on there, was that $2.5 million seed from local investors, or was it people from around the country?
It was local.
Okay.
Well, yeah. So Able Foundation was one of the investors. I'm sure you are very familiar with Able, a local nonprofit that supports startup companies in the Baltimore area. I was fortunate. I think being on the investment side, I had a number of individuals who I went to right away. I left Brown in October, and that's why I always say Vita started in October, because that's when the first full-time employee joined. And I kind of left that experience with about $1 million of seed round, just from some of my partners and folks on the research team who just believed in me as an individual. So we were really fortunate to kind of have that ecosystem as we kind of got started, some financial flexibility really, really early on, but it all came, that $2.5 million all came from local folks in the Baltimore, Maryland ecosystem. So it was really, really helpful. So as I said, after we gotten that, up and running and brought in some resources to replicate that science that we've been doing, that's when we really went out and we started launching Series A. So at the time, we had closed that seed round in January of 2020. We technically launched the Series A in February of 2020. And we were probably too early to be launching an A round after a seed round, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to get some, initial feedback and constructive criticism on what our ideas were. And as you know, it was an interesting time because the pandemic hit just a few weeks later. So that definitely delayed things a little bit. For a few months, the world was ending, right? All of markets, not just biotech, was crumbling. So it kind of allowed us to take the additional time that was really necessary to continue building the story out and putting together the programs that we really hadn't done just yet. And that kind of put us towards the second half of 2020, where we met a number of different investors who are really interested. We were fortunate. We actually had 2 different term sheets from a lead investor standpoint. We ended up choosing this group called Cambium Biopharma, which was led by 2 individuals, James Pyer and Fazan Ahmed. Both James and Fazan were stem cell biologists by background, which was incredibly helpful because they had a really good understanding of the technology that we were using and the nuances involved. So there wasn't a lot of hand-holding that we had to do, and they were able to really jump in quite quickly. So we thought that made for a great partner. So they took the lead position, and then we were fortunate to find some really great follow-on investors in a local group called Early Light Ventures, and then 2 non-local groups called Kiwoom Bio and SEM Life Science. So that in collective was about $32 million, and we closed it in the first half of last year. And really those funds take us through the end of this year and really into the end of next year. They kind of get us to both our pre-IND meetings and a little bit into those IND enabling studies as well. So what we did just a few months ago is we officially kicked off a $40 million Series B attempt. We're actually off to a really good start, but really what that $40 million is designed is to actually take us to IND and actually pay for all of the GMP work that's necessary to build the cell lines for each of our phase 1 clinical patients in both clinical trials, VTA100 and VTA300. So really the goal from a financing perspective is that once we have that first IND in hand, middle of next year, and hopefully a second on the way shortly behind that, that's when we're actually planning on launching our Series C, which we hope would be a crossover. And then at that point in time, fast forward, 2 INDs accepted, we initiate our clinical trials. We'll hopefully have some very positive initial interim safety data at some point early to mid 2024. So that's currently the financing strategy. All of that's subject to change based off of what, the current markets in the future look like. But that's the path that we've set up from the very beginning. And thus far, we've been on a really good path to actually make that happen.
Well, you're practicing a culture that successful life science CEOs have to follow, and that's always be raising, right?
Always be raising. Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, you're never done. So just tell some of our listeners, what percentage of your time do you spend externally on keeping the company financed in order to continue your progress?
More and more every day. I was really fortunate. I have a great mentor who is also one of our board members now, Vlad Shorrock. He's actually the CEO, founder of a company called Biohaven back in 2015. And fast forward to today, they have a great FDA-approved drug. They're like an $8 or $9 billion publicly traded company. And one of the first things Vlad said to me when I started Vita was, Doug, you are always raising money. Just be prepared for that. From this day forward, you are always in fundraising mode. And he wasn't wrong. He was absolutely right? So we've had windows, like shortly after closing the seed round or shortly after closing the A round, where, I was able to spend the majority of my time focusing on the infrastructure, kind of building out the team and the technologies that we're doing here at Vita. But now as we get later stage, costs grow and our programs and our passion and our desire to do everything grows, the fundraising becomes so much more important, right? So at this point, I would say I'm probably spending on a weekly basis between 50, 70% of my time on fundraising. And once the Series B closes, my hope would be to go back to, 70%, focusing internally until I feel that we've gotten the company to where is really a comfortable state for us before I go back into probably like a 70, 80% fundraising mode at the launch of our next round. So you're always in fundraising mode. You never stop. You always take any and every opportunity you can to meet with those folks and introduce them to what we're doing here at Vita. But you always got to have that mindset.
Well, I think the key is that it also shows the importance of having good partners and other good leaders in the company, because if you're external a lot of the time, you need the internal focus on both the operations and the scientific and the clinic. So one of the benefits of raising this money is that you recently had a chance to add to your leadership team and the board. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of this new talent you brought into Vita?
Yeah, no, Rich, you're absolutely right. Every good leader is only as strong as the team that, collectively makes up the entire organization. So really early on, we worked with a few different recruiters and really set out this executive search for 3 individuals that we really were hoping to identify. We ended up bringing all 3 of those individuals on. They have been fantastic. Without them, I would not be able to spend nearly as much time as I am right now on the fundraising mode. So all 3 have a pretty similar number of years experience, but in 3 entirely different spaces and backgrounds altogether. So the first that we had brought on, so Dr. Amy Wessa, she's our SVP of Preclinical and Translational Research. Really the best way to think about her role is scientific operations. Her job is to make sure we're progressing the experiments that we're doing on a daily basis, at the same time that's meeting our external goals and what we're setting the company out there to achieve. She's been absolutely wonderful. She's probably been the individual the most that's allowed me to kind of step back and make sure I'm focusing more on that financing perspective from a company perspective. The next individual that we brought on was Dr. Alejandra Capella. She actually goes by Shauna. And she was actually a consultant that we had worked with for about a year prior to bringing her full time. But she focuses on, she's our SVP of regulatory and IND enabling strategy. So she's actually helped us put together the regulatory path for both programs. We actually had an interactive meeting with the FDA not too long ago. She actually led that meeting. It was a really great, really positive interaction. So she's been fantastic in helping us really set the path from a preclinical to actually, IND in place. And then more recently, we brought on the third individual, Michael Kuhl, who's our SVP of manufacturing. When it comes to cell therapy, CMC is pretty much everything, right? You got to make sure you have a really good GMP process that the FDA actually allows you to go out and then, test on human beings. So Michael, really great background in that he spent about 20, 25 years of his career in the CMC space. He's actually built out GMP facilities before. So we were able to identify him. And he just joined recently to help us take over managing the two different GMP relationships that we have right now. And then beyond that, we also brought on a new board member, Dave Churchill. He's the CFO at Brown. As we are gearing up for this next financing and as we're looking and setting our eyes on the crossover and IPO path, we thought it would be really helpful to bring on somebody with a pure finance background who could help us with that audit process, making sure that our financials were in line with what is needed to actually take a company public. So we ended up convincing Dave to join us. He's been really great and helpful in helping us get that process started.
John, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's a heavy lift, and it makes your lift a little lighter now.
Absolutely.
A lot of people were wondering that are trying to grow companies, regardless of where they are in the country or the world. What are you doing with your workforce culture right now from a standpoint of the pandemic, hybrid, in-person? How much more flexibility do you have with people you're recruiting and your current employees? And I'm sure, it's based on their responsibilities, but give me a little feel and give the listeners a little feel about what your workforce culture is.
Sure. So, like all companies, the pandemic hit us pretty hard, but in particular, I think it hit a company like Vita probably a little harder in the sense that from a scientific perspective, you can't be virtual. You got to be in the lab. And I can't build a lab at everyone's individual home. So I'm able to laugh now, but I'm crying on the inside as I say this to you. When it first hit, we went through so many different challenges that, we never really saw ourselves going. At the time, Hopkins actually only allowed one individual inside the lab. And we were like, well, how do we train anyone, right? We were actually thinking about using GoPros and setting up videos so that people could be in different rooms and do training, right? Our fourth hire was supposed to start on March 16th, which was the first day of quarantine. That individual was our lab tech. So somebody 100% in the lab. He didn't end up getting started until January of that previous year. We kept him on payroll and he kind of helped in some other areas, but it was certainly, a challenge. Thankfully, as we've progressed and vaccines have come out, we've been able to kind of move forward and get a lot of folks in. So right now we're about 26 people, and I would say about 20 are full-time permanently in the lab on a regular basis. We have only one employee who's actually fully remote. And then I would say we have about 5 employees who are more on the operational and management perspective who offer a little bit of hybrid. So our goal and the culture that we want to create is that anyone who's not essentially needed in that lab, we want to create an environment that can be both virtual and on-site. I'm a big believer in seeing people and having those face-to-face meetings. I think you can build a relationship more effectively that way. But we're all for having the right lifestyle. And sometimes it's easier to do things off-site on your own. So that's what we're hoping to bring on. I think as we look to grow in the future and get bigger, I think we'll start to bring on more of those hybrid type roles, more folks on the management and operational side, especially as we move into clinical trials. People who take those roles and manage those types of responsibilities at the companies, they could really be anywhere. So I think we'll look to bring on more folks, but predominantly we've been pretty full-time on-site at Vita.
I think that's very healthy. And you don't have the luxury of a lot of companies that can have totally virtual or hybrid because your work is done in a laboratory.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about Baltimore and the biohealth capital region and how good or it's been for you to grow your business from inception to where you are today. And, a lot of people don't believe these things can happen in Baltimore, but actually you're proving they can.
It's a great point, and I probably touched on it a little bit earlier. I think that mindset's starting to change. And I think if you go back 7-10 years ago, I don't think Baltimore necessarily had that infrastructure set up for a life science company to go ahead and get started. And if it wasn't for Fast Forward allowing us to get a bench and then a private lab and then few private labs, we wouldn't be here. we'd be out of the Baltimore area for sure, and maybe even out of Maryland in general. So what's been so great is that there's now an existing infrastructure that's growing, right? There's also a lot of projects in the not too distant future for future lab space. But that kind of allowed us to, really get started at Hopkins. And then as we kind of hit that next level, right, and grew to 26 people, we needed to find a bigger space, right? We needed to find a space that we could, for the foreseeable future, see the company growing to. And one of the slight challenges of having all those different private labs is we were in 3 different buildings in 6 different private spaces in total, right? So logistically, it still created a little bit of a challenge for us, but we were really fortunate to find a brand new 10,000 square foot space for Vita at the University of Maryland BioPark. And beyond that, one of the things that attracted us to the BioPark that is really important for a company like Vita and also helps drive costs down is once you join the BioPark, you actually get access to some things in the University of Maryland ecosystem that traditional companies wouldn't actually have access to. So we were able to move the whole company in. We actually moved in about 3 months ago. And for the first time ever, we got the entire company on site. So both office and operations with everyone in the lab. And it's been wonderful ever since. So I think those resources have really allowed us to get started. It's funny, since we started Vita, people have always been asking, when are you going to move out of Baltimore? And when are you going to expand? And I think, to be fair, we've always had this mindset, one day we'll have to think outside. But I don't know if that mindset's necessarily the case anymore. I think there's a lot of really great projects that are on the horizon where life science is coming to Maryland and more space is going to be available. So at this point, I think it's very likely the entire company will always stay in Maryland. And it's very possible that we'll look to grow beyond the 10,000 square foot space that we have right now in Baltimore.
I think that's great, Doug, because I think you can help be a disciple for the region as you're going out to talk to everybody, where you're raising money, tell them what a great environment it is, and they should be thinking about making more investments here, as well as the people that you're recruiting now to come to your company can understand that the ecosystem here is equal to some of the others in the country that everybody talks about first before they start talking about our backyard.
Exactly.
Congrats. So I don't know what we haven't covered yet, but I'll give you the opportunity. And we're talking with Doug Falk, who's the co-founder and CEO of Vita Therapeutics. The mic's yours. Anything that we have forgotten to talk to the listeners about?
Rich, I think you've done a good job of asking some really great questions here that collectively covers, where we came from, what we're working on, and hopefully where we're going. But maybe one theme that I'll just throw out there, our goal at Vita is we truly want to become a global leader in cell engineering. We find ourselves to be on the cutting edge of the life science community as a whole. There's not many companies out there that are combining as many new technologies as we are here at Vita. So anyone who's passionate about that, anyone who shares this desire to kind of take medicine to the next level, right? Instead of just working towards mitigating symptoms, we actually at Vita, we want to restore functionality, right? We actually want to take these patients back to one step forward. So, anyone who's interested in joining a growing company filled with really passionate, talented people, I would just encourage them to reach out and get in touch. But I think beyond that, I think we've covered a lot of points, Rich, and I really appreciate you inviting me on the show. This was a great time spent, and I look forward to continue having more conversations like this with you.
Well, thanks, Doug. But we can't let those people out there hanging that want to join the company. You got to let them know how they get in touch with you.
Sure. There's many different ways that you can get in touch with us. On our website, there's a careers page. Anyone can submit their application, their resume through that. They can reach out to one of our director of HRs, Carrie Roeder. You can get in touch with her via LinkedIn, also through that LinkedIn page, the careers website page. So there's a few different ways right there for folks to get involved.
Super. Thank you. This has been really thought-provoking and really nice to talk to an up-and-coming and future success. Even though you're successful to date, you have a few other milestones you'd like to achieve.
We're just getting started, Rich. That's how I feel.
Yeah, I know you're just getting started. You're on the right track. So I want to thank Doug Falk, who's the co-founder and CEO of Vita Therapeutics, for being on BioTalk today, and wish you the best of luck, Doug.
Thank you, Rich. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.